From the cold, lonely streets to a life of success, Jason's journey is one of unexpected hope and unshakable determination. Homeless and broken, he seemed lost to the world. But deep inside, a spark remained. What began as a struggle to survive became a powerful story of transformation, fueled by the kindness of strangers and his own refusal to quit. This is the story of how hitting rock bottom can sometimes be the first step toward rising higher than you ever imagined. Step into Jason's story of resilience. Jason had never imagined that one day he would find himself living on the streets. As a young man with big dreams, he had once believed that hard work and ambition could conquer anything. He had grown up in a modest neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and the future seemed filled with possibilities. He had a steady job at a tech company, a small but cozy apartment, and a relationship that he thought was the cornerstone of his happiness. But all of that changed in a matter of months. The first blow came unexpectedly. The economy had taken a hit, and his company, like so many others, had to cut back. Jason, despite his dedication, was laid off, his job lost to the grim reality of the recession. He had never imagined that he would be one of the ones left behind. At first, he stayed positive, telling himself that he'd find another job soon enough. But weeks passed, then months, and the rejection emails began to pile up in his inbox. Each rejection felt like a knife to his pride, and soon, desperation began to creep in. The second blow came even harder. His long-term partner, Sarah, had been his rock. They had shared their dreams, their fears, their plans for the future. But when Sarah found out about his struggle, she didn't react the way he hoped. She wasn't angry at him for losing his job. She was disappointed. "I can't keep waiting for you to figure things out," she had said, packing her things into boxes, her voice tinged with sadness. "I need someone who can stand on their own." Jason tried to hold on to her, to convince her that he would get back on his feet, but Sarah was already gone. He watched as she left their apartment, the door clicking shut behind her, and he was left standing in the silence of their once shared home. Alone. That night, Jason curled up in bed, unable to sleep. The world felt like it had closed in on him. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? Months passed, and the weight of his situation only grew heavier. Unable to afford rent, Jason sold most of his possessions, his furniture, his electronics, even the few cherished books he had kept. He moved from one friend's couch to another, but eventually his friends grew tired of his endless struggles. They all had their own lives to manage, and Jason didn't want to be the person who overstayed their welcome. So, with nowhere else to turn, he ended up on the streets. His first night on the streets was a shock to his system. The harsh cold of the concrete under him seeped into his bones, and the sounds of the city, sirens wailing in the distance, the muffled chatter of people walking by, the hum of traffic, felt deafening. He lay on a bench in a public park, his thin jacket offering little protection from the chill. The world around him seemed indifferent, as if his presence didn't matter at all. Every morning was the same. He woke up, stiff from the cold, disoriented, and unsure of where to go next. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in hours. He would shuffle through the city streets, trying to find something to eat, someplace to rest, and most of all, trying to avoid the people who passed by without even acknowledging him. The stares, the subtle shifts away when he came too close. It was as if he didn't exist to them, just a shadow in the periphery of their busy lives. Jason quickly learned to avoid the police and the street vendors who were suspicious of anyone without money. He spent his days wandering, trying to find a corner where he could sit without drawing attention, trying to keep to himself. There were moments when he would sit on a park bench, his head in his hands, wondering how he had ended up in this situation. It seemed impossible that just a year ago, he had been living a completely different life. Now, everything he had worked for felt like a distant dream. But the hardest part was the loneliness. Being invisible to the world was one thing. Being isolated from human connection was another. Jason often watched people from a distance, seeing couples walking hand in hand, families laughing together, friends chatting over coffee. He felt the sting of loss every time, but the pain was often too overwhelming to acknowledge. Instead, he focused on survival, on finding food, on staying warm, on getting through another day. Some nights, when the cold was unbearable, he would try to sleep under the awning of a convenience store or in a subway station. The sounds of the trains rushing past, the muffled chatter of commuters, became his lullaby. He would close his eyes and pretend that the world hadn't abandoned him, that tomorrow might be different. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be. Tomorrow would be just like today, endless wandering, endless survival. There were moments when he felt like giving up, when the weight of his situation felt too heavy to bear. He would sit on the curb, eyes blank, feeling the sting of tears threatening to spill, but he refused to cry. Crying was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he buried his emotions deep, pushing them down into the pit of his stomach where they festered, becoming a silent, suffocating ache. The hardest part was accepting that this was his new reality. Jason had become a part of the background noise of the city, someone people passed by without thinking twice. He had become the invisible man, a shadow among the hustle and bustle of life. And every time someone walked past him without a second glance, Jason's heart broke just a little more. But there was something deep inside him, something buried beneath the layers of despair that refused to let go. A flicker of hope, a whisper in the back of his mind that told him, this isn't the end. As the weeks turned into months, Jason's mind slowly began to shift. There was no denying the reality of his situation, but somewhere in the deepest corner of his soul, he knew that he couldn't let this be his final story. He had survived this long. Maybe, just maybe, he could survive a little longer. And if he could survive, maybe he could find a way to start over. But for now, the streets were his world. And in this world, survival was all that mattered. The rain had started falling around midnight, an unrelenting downpour that soaked Jason to the bone as he wandered aimlessly through the streets. The cold cut through him like a knife, the kind of chill that sunk deep into the bones, making every movement feel sluggish, every breath sharp and shallow. He had been kicked out of the shelter earlier that evening when it reached full capacity. The workers there had been kind, but there was nothing they could do. "We're sorry, we have no more space tonight," they had said, their voices filled with a practiced sympathy that only seemed to remind Jason of how far he had fallen. With nowhere else to go, he had left, walking in the rain, hoping that the streets would somehow provide. But the streets had nothing left to give. Not tonight. Jason's feet were numb, his shoes soaked through, and his stomach had been empty for hours. His hands trembled, not only from the cold, but from the gnawing hunger inside him. He had learned to ignore the hunger at times, to push it to the back of his mind, but tonight it felt unbearable, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. The light from the street lamps barely pierced the sheets of rain, casting long, lonely shadows on the wet pavement. Each footstep felt heavy, like it was carrying the weight of a lifetime. The subway station was just ahead, and Jason knew it was his best chance to get out of the cold for a few hours. He had slept there before, blending into the shadows, hoping that the officers wouldn't find him, hoping that no one would notice he was there. He didn't expect warmth or comfort, just a small reprieve from the bitter chill. He slipped into the station, where the noise of rushing trains seemed to muffle the world outside. He found an empty corner, away from the benches and the ticket machines, and sat down on the cold tile floor. His back pressed against the wall, and he wrapped his arms around his knees, trying to hold himself together. He could feel the weight of the day dragging him down. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the despair, everything seemed to pile on top of him, suffocating him. Jason closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the wall, trying to gather his thoughts, trying to push away the tears that threatened to spill. He wasn't the kind of man who cried. He hadn't been that person for a long time. But now, with nothing left but the endless stretch of night before him, it felt as if the walls were closing in. And that's when it happened. A woman's voice broke through his thoughts, soft yet clear, cutting through the sound of the rain and the rumble of the trains. "Are you okay?" Jason opened his eyes, startled. There, standing in front of him, was a woman in her mid-30s. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore an apron, suggesting she had just finished her shift at a nearby cafe. She wasn't offering him money or a handout, something he had grown used to from well-meaning strangers. She wasn't offering anything at all, except her attention. It was the simplest thing, but in that moment, it felt like everything. He looked up at her, unsure of how to respond. His first instinct was to tell her that everything was fine, that he was just tired, that he didn't need help. But the words wouldn't come. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days, not in a meaningful way, not since the last time he had been kicked out of the shelter. His mouth felt dry and his throat tightened. Instead, he just nodded weakly, too ashamed to admit that he was far from okay. The woman didn't wait for an answer. She sat down next to him, her body turned slightly toward his, her expression full of concern but not pity. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether he was someone who could be helped. Then she spoke again. "You don't have to say anything, but if you need anything, food, a place to sit, someone to talk to, I'm here." Jason was stunned by her kindness. People didn't do that. They didn't sit next to someone like him, didn't look at him like he mattered. Most people walked by, pretending they didn't see him, pretending he wasn't there. They avoided eye contact. They hurried along with their lives, too busy to be bothered by someone like him. But this woman, this stranger, sat with him, offering nothing but the simple gift of human connection. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jason felt seen, and it shattered him. He felt the weight of his isolation, the crushing loneliness that had followed him for months, and it all came rushing to the surface. His chest tightened, and his throat burned with the tears he had held back for so long. Jason turned his face away, trying to hide the tears that now poured down his cheeks. He wasn't sure if he was crying out of relief, out of shame, or out of sheer exhaustion from the weight of it all. But it didn't matter. The tears came anyway, and he couldn't stop them. Maria, the woman, didn't move. She didn't try to comfort him with empty words or promises. She just sat there, quietly beside him. Her presence was enough. For the first time in months, Jason didn't feel alone. She didn't need to fix him. She didn't need to solve his problems. All she did was sit with him, offering the simple gift of kindness. That was the moment when everything changed for Jason. He realized that he couldn't keep living like this, that he couldn't keep wandering from one day to the next, barely hanging on. He had been so focused on surviving, on getting through the day, that he had forgotten what it meant to hope, to dream, to live with purpose. As the rain continued to pour outside, Jason made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know how or when, but he knew that he couldn't stay on this path any longer. Something had to change. He couldn't continue living in the shadows, drifting from place to place, feeling invisible to the world. He had to fight for a better life. Jason wiped his eyes, took a deep breath, and looked at Maria. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She simply nodded, offering him a warm smile before standing up. "If you need anything," she said, "come by the cafe sometime. I'll be there." Then she turned and disappeared into the night. Jason stayed in that corner for a long time after she left, but the emptiness inside him no longer felt unbearable. The simple kindness of a stranger had rekindled something inside him, something he thought he had lost forever. A spark of hope. For the first time in months, Jason believed that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The morning after that quiet encounter with Maria, Jason woke up with a feeling he hadn't experienced in what felt like years. A flicker of something that could almost be mistaken for hope. For the first time, he didn't wake up with the overwhelming weight of despair pressing on his chest. Instead, the air felt slightly different. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and the sky bright but cloudy, a sign that the storm had passed, both outside and within him. The streets were still cold, and the hunger gnawed at his stomach, but something inside Jason had shifted. That simple, kind act had ignited something. A tiny spark that told him there was more to life than just surviving, that perhaps there was a way out of this endless cycle of despair. As he walked through the streets that morning, he found himself thinking about the words Maria had said. "If you need anything, come by the cafe." Those words echoed in his mind, resonating in a way that he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the kindness. It was the belief that someone like her, someone who had no obligation to him, still cared, still saw him as a human being, worth the time and effort to offer a moment of compassion. For the first time in months, Jason didn't feel invisible. And more than that, he didn't want to remain invisible any longer. His feet carried him toward the community center he had seen countless times, but never thought to enter. The building was small, worn down by years of use, its brick walls covered in the grime of city life. A modest sign above the door read, "Help for the Homeless." Jason had seen it every time he passed by, but it always seemed too intimidating, too foreign, a place for people who were desperate, who had no options left. And that was exactly what he had become. A person with no options, no future. But now, as he stood in front of it, staring at the sign, he felt something different. A surge of determination that almost made him turn around. Almost. He hesitated. His hands were cold, his stomach still empty, and his heart raced with doubt. The thought of walking in there, admitting to strangers that he was lost and needed help, felt almost more humiliating than the cold pavement beneath him. But then he thought about Maria. He thought about the simple act of kindness she had shown him, and something in him clicked. If she could believe in him, maybe it was time to believe in himself. He knew deep down that he couldn't continue living like this. He had survived this long, but survival wasn't enough anymore. He needed to find a way out. If he didn't take this step, he might never get another chance. With a deep breath, Jason pushed open the door of the community center and stepped inside. The warmth hit him first. It was a stark contrast to the chill of the streets, and for a moment, he just stood there, absorbing it, his eyes adjusting to the soft lights and the hum of voices in the background. It was a place of quiet but palpable energy. A place where people came not just to survive, but to rebuild. He could see the people around him, some of them sitting at tables with forms and pamphlets, others talking quietly to staff members. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a feeling that these people weren't just waiting for life to happen. They were actively trying to change it. Jason walked up to the front desk, where a woman with short, curly hair was sitting. She looked up at him with a kind smile, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jason didn't feel like a burden. She was warm, her eyes soft but direct, as if she could see beyond the grime and the exhaustion on his face. "Hi, how can I help you today?" she asked. Jason opened his mouth, but for a moment, no words came. His throat tightened, and the reality of what he was doing hit him. But then he took a deep breath, pushing past the doubt, and spoke. I need help. I'm homeless. I don't know what to do, where to go. I need something, anything." The woman nodded, her smile never wavering. "You're in the right place," she said. "Let's get you started. We'll help you figure out your next steps." She handed him a form to fill out, asking basic questions about his situation. Jason's hands trembled slightly as he filled it out, but he didn't stop. He answered honestly, even though it felt like exposing a part of himself he hadn't wanted to face. "How long have you been homeless? Do you have any medical needs? What is your greatest need right now?" Every question seemed to peel back another layer of the facade he had built over the past few months. For so long, he had convinced himself that he didn't need help, that he could handle it on his own. But here, in this place, he was forced to confront the truth. He couldn't do it alone. And that was okay. Once the form was completed, the woman looked it over quickly and then picked up the phone. "I'm going to connect you with Rachel," she said. "She's one of our social workers, and she'll be able to help you get connected with a shelter and other resources." Jason nodded, feeling a small sense of relief, though his heart was still pounding in his chest. A few minutes later, a woman with dark hair and glasses came out from the back office. "Rachel." She extended her hand to him, and when Jason took it, he felt a sense of reassurance, like someone had just offered him a lifeline. "Hi, Jason," she said, her voice calm but compassionate. "I've read through your form, and I think we can get you the help you need. There are a few shelters with available beds, and we can get you signed up for job training and other programs that could help. Let's take this one step at a time, okay?" Jason nodded, his voice caught in his throat as he tried to suppress the lump that had formed there. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words, how much he needed to feel like there was still a chance for him. Rachel went on to explain the different services available to him, from short-term shelter to long-term rehabilitation programs. She spoke with such kindness, not as if she were helping a charity case, but as if she genuinely believed Jason could turn his life around. It was a far cry from the indifference he had felt on the streets. where he had been nothing more than a faceless figure in a sea of people. As they talked, Rachel made a few phone calls and arranged for Jason to stay at a nearby shelter that had an open bed. She also gave him information about support groups and community programs that could help him rebuild his life. Jason listened intently, a quiet sense of hope rising within him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a chance, like there were people who genuinely cared about his future. Before he left, Rachel handed him a small booklet with more resources and contact information. "This is just the beginning, Jason," she said with a smile. "We're here to help you every step of the way. You don't have to do this alone." Jason looked down at the booklet in his hands, feeling its weight. Not just in terms of paper, but in the weight of possibilities it carried. He had taken the first step, and though he knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, for the first time in months, Jason felt like he was no longer walking alone. He walked out of the community center that day with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to believe that things could get better. Enough to give him the courage to keep moving forward. And that, he realized, was all he needed for now. The first night in the temporary shelter was a blur for Jason. He had never slept in a place like this before. Warm, secure, with blankets that didn't feel damp from the rain. The bed, though basic, felt like a small victory. He lay there, staring up at the ceiling, the sound of quiet murmurs from other residents drifting through the room. For the first time in what felt like years, he didn't have to worry about the cold or the fear of being robbed or harassed. He could just sleep. But even in the comfort of the shelter, sleep didn't come easy. His mind was racing with everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. The form he had filled out, the conversation with Rachel, the overwhelming kindness of people who had been strangers to him only a day ago. It was all too much to process. But there was a part of him, deep down, that knew this was a turning point. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a small, pulsing seed of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to quiet his doubts, if only for a little while. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new, something he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for, but something he knew he had to try. The next morning, Jason woke up early, just as the sun was beginning to filter through the thin curtains of the shelter. He had been given a breakfast ticket the night before, and although he wasn't used to eating in communal spaces, the thought of food, real food, was enough to coax him out of bed. As he walked to the cafeteria, he saw the other residents, some sitting quietly, others speaking in low voices as they ate together. It wasn't the kind of life he had imagined, but it was a life. And for now, that was enough. After breakfast, Rachel arrived at the shelter to check in with Jason and go over the plans for his next steps. She had a calm but purposeful way about her, and Jason felt a quiet sense of trust in her. She wasn't just there to guide him through paperwork or bureaucracy. She was there to help him rebuild his life, piece by piece. "We have some resources here that can help you, Jason," Rachel said as they sat down at a table in a quiet corner of the shelter. "There's a job training program that can teach you skills in construction, plumbing, and even customer service. It's not going to be easy, but it's a good place to start. We also have a few educational programs where you can work toward earning your GED if you haven't finished school." Jason looked down at the paperwork in front of him, the offers of training and education staring up at him in bold text. A small part of him wanted to shrink away from it all. He hadn't thought about job training in years, let alone his education. He felt a pang of shame, remembering the time he had dropped out of school when life got too complicated, when he couldn't keep up with the pressure. But now, looking at the forms in front of him, he realized that this was his chance to make up for those lost years. The road ahead would be long, but it was better than the alternative of continuing to wander the streets. Rachel noticed his hesitation. "I know it feels overwhelming right now," she said gently, as if reading his mind. "But we'll take this one step at a time. You don't have to do everything at once. It's about progress, not perfection. And we're here to support you every step of the way." Jason nodded slowly, taking in her words. He wasn't sure how he could manage all of this, training, education, therapy, but he was determined to try. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a shot at something more, something real. Maybe he could build a life that was his again. Rachel also encouraged Jason to attend group therapy sessions. At first, Jason wasn't sure about it. He had never been one to talk openly about his feelings or confront his past. The idea of sitting in a room with strangers, discussing his struggles and failures, felt uncomfortable and foreign. But Rachel assured him that it could be a valuable tool for his healing, a safe space where he could learn to process his emotions and develop the coping strategies he needed to move forward. So, with some reluctance, Jason attended his first group therapy session. It was held in a small, dimly lit room at the shelter, with chairs arranged in a circle. The group consisted of 6 people, all different ages and backgrounds, but each with their own struggles and stories. The facilitator, a kind woman named Linda, introduced herself and explained the purpose of the group: to offer support, to share experiences, and to build a sense of community among people who had faced similar challenges. Jason sat at the back, quietly observing, unsure of what to expect. When it was time for introductions, Jason hesitated. He wasn't ready to share his story with strangers, especially not in a room full of people who seemed so much more confident and put together than he felt. But Linda gently encouraged him. "You don't have to share if you're not comfortable," she said with a warm smile. "But we're all here to listen and support each other. Just take your time." Jason took a deep breath, his palms sweaty. He glanced around the room, noting the vulnerability in the faces of the others. It wasn't just him who had fallen. Everyone in that room had been knocked down by life in some way. And somehow, that made it a little easier for him to speak. "I'm Jason," he said quietly, his voice shaky. "I've been homeless for a while. I lost my job a few months ago, and I just couldn't get back on my feet. It's been hard, really hard." The group members nodded sympathetically, offering quiet words of encouragement. One man, a middle-aged veteran named Tom, spoke up. "I know what you mean. I was in your shoes not too long ago. It's tough to see a way out when you're in it, but trust me, there is a way out. You just have to keep moving forward, even when it feels impossible." Jason listened, his heart starting to ease. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. He could feel the weight of his past, the guilt and shame, but hearing the stories of others who had been through similar struggles gave him a sense of possibility. Maybe he wasn't beyond redemption. Maybe, just maybe, he could turn things around. As the session continued, Jason began to share more. Little by little, he opened up about his past, his failed relationships, his regrets, the sense of hopelessness that had clouded his life for so long. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was painful, and at times he felt overwhelmed by the emotions that surfaced. But with each word, he felt a little lighter, a little freer. He realized that the path to healing wasn't just about fixing his circumstances. It was about confronting the emotional scars that had kept him stuck in the cycle of self-doubt and despair. By the end of the session, Jason felt exhausted, but strangely empowered. For the first time in a long time, he had been able to acknowledge his pain without burying it. And that, he realized, was the first step toward healing. That night, as he lay in his bed at the shelter, Jason felt something new, a sense of determination. The road ahead would be hard. He knew that. There would be days when he wanted to give up, days when the weight of his past would threaten to crush him. But for the first time in a long while, Jason was ready to face it, one step at a time. With the support of people like Rachel, the group, and even Maria, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. It didn't take long for Jason to land his first job after arriving at the shelter. The position wasn't glamorous, far from it. The local diner on the corner, a greasy spoon that had seen better days, needed someone to clean the floors and wash the dishes. It wasn't the kind of job Jason had once dreamed of, but it was a job nonetheless. The pay was low, just enough to cover his most basic expenses, but it was something he could hold on to, a tangible step toward rebuilding the life he had lost. His first day on the job was harder than he anticipated. The manager, a gruff man named Bill, handed him a rag and directed him to the back, where the kitchen staff worked in a frenzy, preparing food for a steady stream of customers. Jason had worked in restaurants before, but never in a position like this. Never as the one who was invisible, the one who cleaned up after others. As he scrubbed pots and swept the floor, he felt the weight of judgment from some of the other workers. There were whispers when he walked by, quick glances that looked him up and down, sizing him up like a stranger. It was the same feeling he had gotten on the streets, being seen, but not really seen. Not as a person, just a task to be managed. Even the patrons didn't make him feel welcome. Some of them treated him as if he were invisible, others with a cold, dismissive air. There was one particularly rude woman who made a comment about the floors being filthy as she walked in, her eyes sweeping over Jason's worn clothes as if they were a reflection of the restaurant's cleanliness. It stung, though he tried not to show it. He had gotten used to the sharpness of people's judgments, their quick assumptions about who he was and why he was where he was, but that didn't make it hurt any less. At the end of the shift, Jason walked back to the shelter, his feet sore, his hands raw from the constant scrubbing. The physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the emotional weight he carried, though. He wondered if this was all he would ever be, just a man who cleaned up after others, who worked hard but never seemed to catch a break. It was hard not to feel discouraged when he saw the people around him, living lives that seemed so much more put together than his own. That night, as he lay in his bed at the shelter, Jason couldn't shake the feelings of inadequacy. He had taken the first step toward changing his life, yes, but it felt like the weight of his past was still there, following him everywhere he went. He had dreams of something more, something better, but at times the path ahead seemed so long, so uncertain. What if he was always going to be stuck in this cycle, constantly battling his past, never able to move beyond it? But the next morning, when he woke up and headed back to work, something inside him shifted. The doubts were still there, nagging at the edges of his mind, but there was something else too, a quiet resolve, a recognition that the struggle was part of the journey. Jason had lived through the worst of it already. He had survived the streets, the hunger, the loneliness, and now he was doing more than just surviving. He was taking control, even if the progress was slow, even if it wasn't as grand as he had imagined. This job, this small start, was proof that he could rebuild, piece by piece. The days that followed were a blur of cleaning, dishwashing, and the occasional awkward interaction with his coworkers or customers. But with each shift, Jason began to grow more comfortable in his new role. He focused on the work, on the simple satisfaction of a clean kitchen, a shiny floor, and a job well done. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary, and it paid the bills. But it wasn't just the physical work that helped Jason start to rebuild. It was the connections he began to form. There was a man named Carl, an older cook who had been at the diner for years, who had a quiet way about him. At first, Carl had barely acknowledged Jason, but over time, they struck up conversations during their brief breaks. Carl didn't ask Jason about his past, didn't pry into his life, but there was something comforting about his presence. The simple act of someone treating him like a person again, instead of just a homeless man who had stumbled into a job, meant more to Jason than he could express. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Jason and Carl shared a quiet moment in the back of the diner. "You're doing all right," Carl said, lighting a cigarette and leaning against the wall. "It's not the best job, but it's honest work. You keep your head down, do your part, and you'll make it through. Just don't let the assholes get to you." Jason smiled, though it was faint. He appreciated Carl's words, though he wasn't sure if he could ever stop the sting of judgment from others. Still, Carl's encouragement felt like a small lifeline, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. Despite the kindness from Carl and the occasional other workers, the reality was that Jason still faced a lot of stigma. He was living in a shelter, working a minimum wage job, and there were times when the weight of his past seemed too heavy to bear. It felt like everyone around him had it together, while he was still piecing his life back, one broken fragment at a time. Some nights, after a long shift, he would retreat to his bed at the shelter and wonder if it would ever be enough. But it wasn't the judgment that kept him going. It was the small victories. The pride he felt after completing a task, the satisfaction of earning his first paycheck, the hope he saw in the faces of the people at the shelter who were also trying to rebuild their lives. They didn't look down on him for his past. They saw him for who he was now. Someone who was working hard, someone who was trying to move forward. And with each passing day, Jason took one more step toward the future he had always dreamed of. It wasn't going to be easy. The path ahead was still unclear, filled with challenges and setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, Jason could see that there was more to his life than just survival. There was the possibility of something better, a life worth fighting for. That was the truth that kept him going. Even when the work was hard, the pay was low, and the judgment from others stung, Jason knew he was moving toward a better tomorrow. And that was enough to fuel his determination to continue rebuilding his life, step by step, no matter how difficult it might be. As the weeks passed, Jason began to settle into his new routine. The work at the diner, though exhausting, provided him with stability, a sense of purpose he hadn't had in years. But even as the weight of rebuilding his life slowly lifted, there was a part of him that still longed for something more. He wanted to break free from the cycle he was in, wanted more than just scraping by from one paycheck to the next. Yet each day felt like another small step forward. And there were moments when Jason wondered if he was truly capable of anything beyond this. It was during one of those long, tiring days that Greg, his shift supervisor, first noticed something in him. Greg was a middle-aged man with a solid build and a calm, no-nonsense demeanor. He had been the supervisor at the diner for as long as Jason had worked there, but their interactions had mostly been limited to brief exchanges about the day's tasks. Jason wasn't the type to draw attention to himself, preferring to blend into the background. But Greg had a way of noticing things about people, things that others missed. One day, after the lunch rush had ended, Greg approached Jason as he was wiping down a table. "You're a hard worker," Greg said, his voice steady. "You don't cut corners. That's rare around here." Jason stopped what he was doing and glanced up at Greg, a little surprised. He hadn't expected to hear anything positive about his work from the gruff supervisor, but Greg's eyes weren't filled with the usual indifference. There was something more in them, an assessment, a recognition. "Thanks," Jason replied quietly, unsure of what to say. "I just do what I can." Greg nodded, as if he had been expecting this response. He didn't say anything else at that moment, but later that evening, when the diner was quieter and the last of the customers had left, Greg took Jason aside. "You know, I used to be in your shoes," Greg said, his voice quieter now, almost like he was speaking to himself. "I was homeless for a long time before I got clean and started over. I know what it's like to feel like you're stuck, like you'll never be anything more than what you were yesterday. But I can see it in you. You're not just here to scrape by. You're looking for something more." Jason stood there, blinking at Greg in surprise. He hadn't known that Greg had been homeless, too. There was no hint of it in his demeanor, no signs of the struggles Greg had clearly endured. He was a manager now, respected by his employees and confident in his work. Jason had never imagined someone like Greg could have walked the same path he had, let alone come out the other side. Greg continued, "I run a small construction company now, and I've been looking for someone to help with some of the lighter jobs. Fixing things around the site, basic repairs, stuff like that. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work, and it's better than working here for the rest of your life. What do you say?" Jason's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. For a moment, he was speechless, uncertain of how to respond. It wasn't just the offer of the job. It was the way Greg had looked at him. The way he saw Jason not as a homeless man, but as someone who had the potential to be more. I don't know," Jason said, unsure. "I've never done anything like that before." Greg smiled, a faint but understanding grin. "I didn't think you had. But you've got the right attitude. The rest can be taught. I'll show you the basics, and if you're willing to learn, I'll teach you everything I know. I know how hard it is to start over. I'm offering you a chance to learn something new, something that can actually build you up, not just tear you down. Think about it." Jason stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. He had been stuck in a cycle for so long, focused on survival, that he hadn't stopped to think about what he really wanted. The idea of doing something different, something more tangible than washing dishes or sweeping floors, excited him. He had never thought of himself as someone who could work with his hands, never imagined he could build or fix things. But now, with Greg's offer hanging in the air, the possibility seemed real. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt the stirring of hope. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steady with determination. "I'll give it a shot." Greg's smile widened. "Good. I'll meet you at the site tomorrow morning at 8. Bring yourself and I'll bring the tools. Don't worry about anything else. You're starting from scratch, and that's okay." The next day, Jason showed up at the construction site, nervous but eager. It wasn't much to look at. An old building that was being renovated, the scaffolding and bare walls a reminder of the work that was still ahead. Greg was already there, waiting, his tool belt fastened tightly around his waist. "Ready?" Greg asked. Jason nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about learning construction. It was about reclaiming his life. Every nail he drove into wood, every beam he lifted, felt like a small victory. Greg guided him patiently, showing him how to use tools, explaining the process of repairs, and teaching him not just the mechanics, but the discipline it took to do the work properly. Greg's guidance was patient and thorough, but also firm. He wasn't treating Jason like a charity case. He was treating him like a student, like someone who had value and could contribute. That made all the difference. As the weeks passed, Jason's confidence grew. He wasn't just cleaning or sweeping anymore. He was building, fixing, contributing to something larger than himself. He was learning a new skill, and each day he felt more like the man he wanted to become. Greg's mentorship didn't just teach him about construction. It gave him something even more valuable: belief in himself. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he was moving forward with purpose. He wasn't just working to survive. He was working to build a future. Greg's faith in him was the key that unlocked something deep inside, something he had long forgotten was there. Jason wasn't just a homeless man anymore. He was someone who could create, who could grow, who could change his life. And with each new skill he learned, he moved closer to the future he had always dreamed of, step by step. Jason's first full day as a full-time employee at Greg's construction company felt surreal. He had come a long way from the days when he had wandered the streets, hungry and hopeless, looking for the next meal or the next shelter to crawl into. Now, he was part of something tangible, something real. As an assistant, he was entrusted with more responsibilities, overseeing smaller jobs, helping with project management, and, of course, continuing to learn the ins and outs of the construction trade. It wasn't glamorous, but it didn't have to be. Stability was the foundation of his new life, and that was all he had ever wanted. Greg had kept his word. He didn't treat Jason like a charity case, but as someone with potential, someone who could learn and grow. As the days turned into weeks, Jason's confidence grew with every project he worked on. His hands, once only familiar with holding a rag or a broom, now handled tools with precision. The weight of the hammer in his grip felt less foreign, the smell of freshly cut wood more inviting. He was learning, growing, becoming someone he was proud to be. But it wasn't just the work that gave Jason a sense of fulfillment. It was the future he could now see clearly ahead of him. Greg had been right all along. The road to recovery wasn't quick, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Each paycheck Jason received was a reminder that he was moving forward. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving, slowly but surely. One morning, after a particularly long day on the job, Greg pulled him aside. They were standing in front of an old building that the team was renovating, looking over the progress they had made so far. "You've come a long way, Jason," Greg said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You're no longer just helping out. You're an essential part of this team." Jason looked at Greg, unsure of how to respond. The words felt heavy, and a part of him still struggled to believe that this was really his life now. Just a year ago, he had been standing on the streets, wondering if he would ever find his way out. But now, here he was, part of a real functioning team, trusted with important work. "Thanks," Jason said, his voice steady, though there was a tremor of emotion in it. I don't know how to thank you. This means everything." Greg gave him a rare smile. "You've earned it, Jason. You've done the hard work. All I did was show you the path." Jason looked around at the construction site, at the progress they had made, and for the first time, he felt a deep sense of pride. It wasn't just the work that mattered. It was what that work represented. It was proof that his life wasn't over, that his past didn't have to define his future. A few months later, Greg offered Jason a more permanent role at the company, one that included a modest salary and full-time benefits. The offer was a turning point, a confirmation that his hard work had paid off in ways that he hadn't even expected. Jason knew he had made it when Greg mentioned that he would be included in the company's profit-sharing plan, something that was usually reserved for senior workers who had been with the company for years. It was an incredible moment for Jason, one that was years in the making. When he accepted the offer, he felt a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't known he was capable of. He wasn't just a man who had been homeless. He was a man with a future, with a career, and with a place in the world. The next step in Jason's journey was finding a home. He had lived in the shelter for so long that it felt strange, even intimidating, to think about moving into a place of his own. But the day finally came when he walked into his new apartment, a small but cozy studio in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was his, something he could call his own. It was a far cry from the cold streets he had once called home, a stark reminder of how far he had come. The first night he spent in the apartment, Jason sat on the small couch he had bought with his first paycheck, looking out the window at the city lights below. He had come so far, and yet there was so much more to do. He had a job now, a home, and a purpose. But he knew this was only the beginning. Jason had always been the kind of person who focused on what was right in front of him, on what needed to be done right then and there. But now, as he sat in his new apartment, he began to think about his future in a way he never had before. He enrolled in night classes at the local community college, eager to learn more about construction and design. He had always been fascinated by how things were built, and now he wanted to be part of creating something lasting, perhaps something beautiful. He could see himself, a few years down the line, running his own business, designing homes, or even working on large-scale projects that would leave a lasting impact on the city. In the meantime, he kept working with Greg, gaining experience, learning more every day. And when his coworkers asked him what the secret to his turnaround was, Jason didn't hesitate to tell them. Hard work, patience, and a little bit of belief, he would say, smiling. And don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it. Over the next few months, Jason's life began to take shape in ways he hadn't thought possible. He began to save money, building a small nest egg for the future. He learned to manage his finances, pay his bills on time, and even began to plan for his next big step, buying a car. It was a small dream, but a significant one, a symbol of his progress, of the life he had built from nothing. Greg continued to mentor him, offering guidance and advice when Jason needed it, but Jason no longer felt like the lost, homeless man he had been. He was someone new, someone capable, someone with a future. His past no longer had the power to define him. The streets were a distant memory, a chapter in his life that he had closed for good. One night, after a long day of work and classes, Jason sat in his apartment, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He had been given a second chance, not by anyone else, but by his own hard work and determination. And though there would still be challenges ahead, Jason knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the person who had once been lost on the streets. He was someone who had found his way, and for the first time in his life, he was truly proud of the person he had become. And as he looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker below, Jason felt a sense of peace wash over him. The future was still uncertain, but it was his to shape. Despite the progress Jason had made, his stable job, his apartment, and the promise of a brighter future, he still couldn't shake the nagging voice in the back of his mind. There were days when it felt like his past was clawing its way back into his thoughts, reminding him of all the mistakes he had made, all the lost time. He wasn't sure if he truly belonged in this new life. The fear that he was an imposter, that he didn't deserve the life he had worked so hard to build, often kept him awake at night. Jason would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling of his small apartment, the sound of the city outside a distant hum. The apartment, though a huge step forward, sometimes felt empty, too big for the person he used to be, and too small for the person he was trying to become. He would replay conversations from work in his mind, wondering if his coworkers could tell he was still struggling, still unsure of his worth. Did they see through the facade? Did they know the homeless man he used to be? The man who still lurked inside? One night, after a particularly tough day at work, Jason found himself sitting on the edge of his bed, his thoughts spiraling. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't rest. He had made so much progress, but something inside him was still holding him back. Maybe he wasn't meant for success. Maybe this new life was just a temporary fix and the streets were where he truly belonged. But just as he was about to give in to that destructive line of thinking, his phone rang. It was Greg. The call was unexpected, especially this late at night, but Jason answered without hesitation. "Hey, Jason," Greg said, his voice calm and steady, just like it always was. "I know it's late, but I wanted to check in on you. How's everything going?" Jason sat up, rubbing his eyes. The last thing he wanted was to burden Greg with his doubts, but the words came out before he could stop them. "I don't know, Greg," Jason admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. I'm not sure I'm cut out for all of this. I've come so far, but some days it feels like I don't belong in this life, like I'm just pretending to be someone I'm not." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, Jason thought Greg might have hung up, or worse, that Greg was disappointed in him. But when Greg spoke again, his voice was filled with the kind of wisdom only someone who had truly struggled could offer. "Jason," Greg said slowly, "I've been where you are. Hell, I've been lower than you can imagine. When I was starting out, I had days just like this. I doubted myself all the time. But you know what? You've already done the hardest part. You've faced the darkest days. You've walked through the worst of it, and you're still here. Don't forget that." Jason felt a lump form in his throat. Greg's words were like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of his fears. Greg didn't sugarcoat things, but there was a deep conviction in his voice. Something that Jason needed to hear in that moment. "You've already made it further than most people ever will," Greg continued. "The doubt you're feeling, that's just your mind trying to tell you that you're not worthy. But you know what? You are. You've already proven that. All you have to do now is keep moving forward, one step at a time, and I'll be here to help you every step of the way. You've got this, Jason." Jason sat in silence, feeling the weight of Greg's words sinking into his heart. It wasn't about being perfect or having everything figured out. It was about persistence. It was about continuing to show up, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. It was about trusting that the progress he had made was real, even on the days when it didn't feel like enough. "Thanks, Greg," Jason said, his voice stronger now. "I needed to hear that." Greg chuckled softly. "Anytime, man. Just remember, you've got a future here. You've got a place in this world. Don't let the doubts take that from you." After they hung up, Jason felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in days. It wasn't that his doubts had disappeared entirely. Those feelings of insecurity still lingered, waiting to sneak back in on weak moments. But now, he had a new perspective. He could move through the doubts. He could let them exist, but not control him. Jason stood up from the bed, pacing around his apartment. The small space felt less empty now. He wasn't a man who had just stumbled into a second chance. He was someone who had earned every bit of the life he had built. His apartment, his job, his future, they were all results of his own hard work, determination, and the courage to keep going, even when he didn't know how. The next morning, Jason woke up earlier than usual, determined to face the day with renewed resolve. He had work to do, yes, but more than that, he had a life to build, a future to claim. He wasn't just working to survive anymore. He was building a life he could be proud of, and that was enough. At work, he was a little more confident. He was no longer walking on eggshells, afraid that someone might find out he didn't belong. He did belong. He had earned his place. Greg had given him the tools to succeed, but it was Jason who had kept moving forward, step by step. When Greg called later that week to check in on him, Jason could feel the difference in his voice. The doubt had shifted, replaced with something more certain, more powerful: belief. "I'm good, Greg," Jason said with a smile in his voice. "I'm good." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. Jason had always been the kind of person who believed that real change didn't just happen for one person. It happened for everyone. As his life continued to evolve, and he gained more confidence in his abilities and his place in the world, the idea of giving back became more and more important to him. He realized that the help he had received in his darkest moments wasn't just about getting by. It was about the hope that someone believed in him enough to help him see a future beyond the streets. And now, he wanted to be that person for someone else. So, one quiet afternoon, Jason made his way back to the community center where he had first sought help. It had been a year since he had filled out the form that had connected him to Rachel, the social worker who had been his first real lifeline out of homelessness. He remembered the fear and uncertainty he had felt walking through those doors, but now, as he stepped inside, he felt a deep sense of peace. He was no longer that lost man. He was someone who could offer a glimmer of hope to those who were just beginning their journeys. Rachel was in her office when Jason arrived, and her face lit up as soon as she saw him. "Jason, I was wondering when you'd come back," she said, her voice warm with affection. "I've been meaning to come by for a while," Jason said, feeling a little nervous but more excited than anything. "I want to help. I've been thinking about how much you and the team helped me, and I want to do the same for others." Rachel smiled, clearly touched. "You're already helping just by being here. I think you're exactly what they need. Someone who's been through it, someone who understands what they're facing. Let me introduce you to a few people." Over the next few weeks, Jason began volunteering at the center, offering his time to speak with those who were in the early stages of rebuilding their lives. He would sit with them, listening to their stories, offering advice where he could, and sharing his own journey. Sometimes his words were simple: one step at a time, or don't be afraid to ask for help. Other times, he would simply sit in silence, allowing them to vent their frustrations and fears without judgment. He knew how powerful it could be just to have someone listen, someone who didn't see them as another statistic, but as a person. Jason also worked closely with Rachel, helping her mentor those who were struggling the most. There were days when he was tempted to retreat, to avoid the painful reminders of where he had been. Some of the people he met reminded him too much of his own past, and it was hard to see them in such a vulnerable state. But he knew that if he could help them even a little, if he could show them that change was possible, it would be worth it. He never pushed anyone, but he always made himself available, whether to talk, to offer a job lead, or to just share a meal. One afternoon, Jason was sitting with a young man named Tony, who had been living on the streets for over a year. Tony had recently entered the shelter and was struggling with the idea of asking for help. He was skeptical, angry, and felt like no one could understand what he was going through. "I don't want to be here," Tony said, his voice filled with bitterness. "I don't want to be a part of this system. It's just a cycle of people who give up on you." Jason listened, understanding all too well the feeling of wanting to run from the system that had helped him. But instead of agreeing with Tony's view, he responded softly. "I get it. Believe me, I do. I fought that feeling for a long time. But let me tell you something. This system isn't about giving up on you. It's about giving you a chance. The rest is up to you. No one can make that decision for you." Tony looked at him, a mixture of confusion and curiosity in his eyes. "You think I can change?" Jason smiled, a glimmer of hope in his heart. "I know you can. I've seen it happen. I've been there. It's not easy, but it's worth it. If you keep moving forward, no matter how small the steps, it gets better. Trust me." Jason's words weren't a magic fix, but they planted a seed. Over time, Tony began to show up to the meetings, to talk to Jason about his past, and to accept the help offered to him. It wasn't a quick fix, but that's what Jason had learned during his own recovery. The process was slow, but with the right support, it was possible. The more Jason gave back, the more he realized that his purpose wasn't just to escape the streets. It was to help others navigate that same journey. The community center had been the key to his own transformation, and now it was the place where he could continue to grow, not just as an individual, but as a member of something bigger. He didn't have all the answers, but he had a story, and that story had the power to inspire change. One day, as Jason was leaving the center after a long afternoon of speaking with some of the shelter residents, Rachel pulled him aside. "Jason, I just wanted to say how proud I am of you," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "When you first came here, I saw the pain you were carrying. But look at you now. You've built something incredible, not just for yourself, but for others. You're exactly the kind of person this center was created for. Jason felt a lump in his throat as he looked at Rachel. She had been there for him when he didn't believe in himself. And now, here she was, acknowledging the man he had become. "Thank you, Rachel," Jason said, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you. Without the center. Without people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with pride. "And now you're doing the same for others. You've paid it forward, Jason. And that's what makes all the difference." As Jason walked out of the community center that day, the sun setting behind him, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come full circle. He was no longer a man who had only known survival. He was someone who could offer hope, someone who could help others believe in their potential. The road ahead was still long, but Jason now understood that the journey wasn't just about personal success. It was about giving back, lifting others up, and creating a community where everyone had the opportunity to rebuild. Years passed, and Jason's life had transformed in ways he had once thought impossible. From the cold, unforgiving streets to a thriving business owner, Jason had built a future for himself, one that was grounded in hard work, resilience, and the belief that his past didn't define him. He had become a successful contractor, running his own company, with a team that looked up to him not just as a boss, but as a mentor and someone who had earned every inch of the success he now enjoyed. His days were filled with the bustle of business, overseeing construction projects, meeting clients, managing a growing staff. He had a beautiful home, a family who loved and supported him, and a life that, on the surface, seemed worlds apart from the man who once wandered the streets, lost and alone. But deep inside, Jason never forgot where he had come from. He couldn't. Every corner he turned, every milestone he reached, was a reminder of the darkness he had fought to overcome. And that darkness, though distant, was what kept his heart grounded. In the quiet moments, when Jason sat in his office or watched his children play in the yard, he often thought back to those early days. The cold nights spent shivering on park benches, the overwhelming loneliness of trying to survive, and the despair of feeling like he had nothing left to lose. It seemed like another lifetime now, yet the memory of those days still shaped the man he had become. What struck him most was the realization that he hadn't done it alone. There had been people who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Greg, who had mentored him in construction, Rachel, who had helped him navigate the system, and the community center that had provided him the tools to rebuild his life. But it hadn't been just their support. It had been his decision to change. It had been his willingness to step forward, one small step at a time, into the unknown, no matter how difficult it seemed. That, more than anything, had made the difference. Jason now took great pride in knowing that his story could inspire others. He was living proof that even the most hopeless situations could lead to something beautiful, something meaningful. He didn't just look back on his past with regret. He looked back with gratitude, knowing that without those hardships, he wouldn't have become the person he was today. He often spoke to others who were struggling, sharing his journey and reminding them that they too had the power to change their circumstances. He was determined to pay forward the hope and encouragement that had been given to him. One day, a young man named Luis came into his office. Luis was in his early 20s, and like Jason had been, he was at a crossroads in life. He had been in and out of shelters, struggling with addiction, and lost in a world of confusion and self-doubt. He had heard about Jason's story from a mutual acquaintance and reached out, unsure of what to expect. Jason listened as Luis poured out his story, his voice tinged with pain and frustration. He saw so much of himself in the young man, someone who had once felt as though the world had forgotten him, someone who believed that success was for others, not for him. After they talked, Jason stood up and walked over to a framed photo on the wall of his office, a photo of the construction team at a job site, smiling and proud of their work. The photo had been taken years ago, right after Jason's first big project as a contractor. "This was me," Jason said, pointing to the photo. "That was my first project, and I was terrified. I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew that if I didn't take that leap, I would never get anywhere. I'd still be stuck, living the same life I was before. And I promise you, Luis, that if you take one step forward, no matter how small, you'll find the way. You'll build something for yourself, just like I did. Luis looked at Jason, doubt and skepticism in his eyes, but Jason could see a flicker of something else. Hope. I don't know if I can do it, Luis said, his voice cracking. Jason placed a hand on his shoulder, the same kind of gesture that Greg had given him all those years ago when he was doubting himself. You don't have to know how to do it all, Luis. You just have to know that you can. You take it one day at a time, one small step at a time. And when you feel like giving up, you reach out. You talk to someone who's been there. You're not alone. Luis nodded slowly, a tear escaping his eye as he wiped it away quickly. For the first time in a long time, he felt like someone believed in him. Jason knew that he couldn't solve all of Luis's problems, just like no one could solve his own for him. But he could offer him something invaluable: encouragement, mentorship, and a glimpse into what was possible. Jason had learned that change didn't come from waiting for the world to give you something. It came from deciding to move, to act, and to fight for a better life, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. As Jason watched Luis leave his office that day, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what it was all about: passing on the lessons he had learned, sharing his story, and helping others rise from their own struggles. His success wasn't just measured by the buildings he had built, but by the lives he had touched along the way. Jason's journey had come full circle. He had gone from a man with nothing but a broken spirit to a symbol of hope in his community. He had built not just a business, but a family, a life, and a future that were filled with purpose. He had faced his darkest fears and emerged stronger, and in doing so, he had shown others that no matter how low you fall, there is always a way to rise again, if you are willing to fight for it. And now, as he stood in his office, watching the sunset cast a warm glow over the city, Jason knew that his story was far from over. It was a story that would continue to inspire, to lift up, and to remind everyone who heard it that no matter where you start, the future is always within reach, if you dare to dream, and if you refuse to give up. Jason's story is a powerful reminder that no matter how low you fall, there is always a way to rise again. From the streets to building a new life, his journey proves that with resilience, determination, and the support of others, anything is possible. Today, Jason stands as a beacon of hope, showing us all that the road to success may be long, but it's never out of reach. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If you were inspired by Jason's transformation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your support helps us continue to share stories that inspire and uplift. Stay tuned for more stories, and remember, no matter where you start, the future is always within your reach.